Everyone in town laughed when 11-year-old Lucy Bennett walked into the store wearing her dead father's oversized, patched coat. But millionaire rancher Caleb Sullivan wasn't laughing. He had noticed the strange symbol carved into one of its old brass buttons. He had seen that symbol before, nearly 20 years ago. Days later, Caleb's 27-year-old horse, Ranger, caught the scent of Lucy's coat and suddenly pulled her toward a stone barn that had been locked for 18 years. What they found inside revealed a secret Lucy's father had taken to his grave, and the real reason someone was trying to take her mother's ranch. The Montana winter of 1891 had arrived early. Snow crusted the open prairie, a hard northern wind rattled the cottonwoods, and the distant mountains disappeared beneath a pale gray sky. Martha Bennett had learned that grief did not disappear with time. It simply found quieter places to live. At 34, she was a tall, slender woman whose once soft figure had grown lean from hauling hay, splitting kindling, and doing work that had once required two people. Her chestnut-brown hair, threaded with a few premature strands of gray near the temples, was usually twisted into a practical knot. Wind and cold had roughened her fair skin, while faint shadows beneath her hazel eyes revealed too many nights spent calculating debts after her daughter had fallen asleep. Yet there was a stubborn steadiness about Martha. She rarely complained, disliked pity, and possessed the quiet pride of someone who would rather mend the same glove 10 times than ask a neighbor to replace it. 2 years earlier, her husband, Thomas Bennett, had died during a winter storm. Thomas had been 37, broad-shouldered and strong, with sandy brown hair, a square jaw, and the short beard he stubbornly refused to shave even when Martha complained that it scratched her cheek. He had been patient with frightened horses and hopeless at remembering where he left his tools. The night he died, he had ridden out after learning that several horses were trapped beyond the North Ridge. His horse returned the following morning without him. Searchers found Thomas after the storm passed. Since then, Martha had carried the farm, its debts, and the terrible responsibility of making sure their daughter never believed her father's sacrifice had destroyed them. 11-year-old Lucy Bennett resembled him enough to sometimes hurt Martha simply by turning her head. Lucy was a thin, long-legged girl with sandy blonde hair, pale freckled cheeks, and large gray-blue eyes that revealed emotions she tried desperately to hide. She was gentle with animals, observant around adults, and had become quieter since her father's death. That morning she wore Thomas's old brown leather coat. It hung nearly to her knees. Martha had rolled the sleeves twice and patched one shoulder with darker leather after the original seam split. They could not afford another coat. Lucy, however, would not have traded it for the finest coat in Montana. One brass button remained near the collar, the same button Thomas had sewn back on one rainy evening while Lucy sat beside him watching his clumsy fingers fight the needle. The Bennett wagon reached the small town shortly before noon. Martha had brought enough coins for flour, lamp oil, salt, and perhaps a little sugar if prices had not risen again. Inside the general store, warmth from an iron stove softened their frozen fingers. Martha began quietly comparing prices while Lucy remained beside her. 2 well-dressed women near the counter noticed them. Mrs. Abigail Whitmore, the round-faced wife of a prosperous livestock dealer, wore a fur-trimmed green coat and carried herself with the effortless superiority of someone accustomed to being agreed with. Beside her stood Clara Finch, a narrow-faced merchant's wife in her 40s who was less cruel by nature but too eager to laugh whenever wealthier people laughed first. Abigail's eyes settled on Lucy. "My goodness," she said. Lucy instinctively moved closer to Martha. Abigail smiled at Clara. "That child looks as though she's wearing a saddle." Clara laughed. A few customers turned. Lucy froze. Martha felt her daughter's fingers tighten around hers. "Perhaps they couldn't find a horse small enough for it," Clara added, encouraged by Abigail's amusement. More laughter followed. Lucy stared at the wooden floor. Suddenly the coat felt enormous. She pulled the sleeves closer to herself, trying somehow to become smaller inside it. Martha's face grew hot. For one dangerous second, every exhausted part of her wanted to answer them. She wanted to tell Abigail that Thomas had died trying to save living creatures while men twice his size had stayed beside their fires. She wanted to ask what kind of woman needed an 11-year-old child beneath her before she could feel tall. But Martha knew how small towns worked. Abigail's husband purchased horses. Clara's family extended store credit. Pride could cost them groceries. So Martha swallowed the words. "Come, Lucy." Lucy followed her toward the door. "Ma," she whispered once they reached the boardwalk. "I don't have to wear Papa's coat anymore." Martha stopped. That hurt more than the laughter. She knelt despite the snow beneath her skirt and gently lifted Lucy's chin. "You wear what you choose because you love him," Martha said. "Never let cruel people decide what you're allowed to love." Lucy nodded, although her eyes remained wet. Neither noticed the man who had watched them leave. Caleb Sullivan stood near the rear wall of the store. At 42, Caleb was an imposing man, just over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders shaped by decades in saddles rather than drawing rooms. His dark brown hair showed silver at the temples, and a neatly trimmed beard followed the hard line of his jaw. A narrow scar crossed his left eyebrow, giving his otherwise controlled expression a permanently severe edge. He owned Sullivan Horse Ranch, one of the largest operations in that part of Montana, yet he dressed in a weathered charcoal coat and mud-stained boots. Wealth had made Caleb cautious rather than arrogant. Years of bargaining with dishonest cattlemen had taught him to speak little and notice everything. He had heard the laughter, but that wasn't why he was staring. Just before Lucy walked outside, sunlight from the window had struck the brass button near her collar. Caleb had seen the engraving, a horse beneath 3 small stars. His expression changed. He crossed the store quickly and looked through the frosted window as Martha and Lucy climbed into their wagon. For several seconds, Caleb did not move. Then he whispered a name he had not spoken in years. Thomas Bennett. Because nearly 20 years earlier, Caleb had seen that exact symbol somewhere else. And Thomas had been standing beside him when he did. The following afternoon, Martha saw a lone rider approaching across the snow-covered pasture. When she recognized Caleb Sullivan, suspicion tightened in her chest. Wealthy men rarely rode 6 miles through winter wind without wanting something in return. Caleb dismounted beside the sagging fence and came to the porch carrying no parcel, no new coat, and, to Martha's relief, no envelope of money. "Mrs. Bennett," he said, removing his hat, "I'd like to offer your daughter a job." Martha stared at him. "Lucy is 11. I noticed. That generally limits a person's qualifications." For the first time, Caleb almost smiled. He explained that he owned an aging horse requiring patient attention. Lucy would brush him, carry water, measure his feed under supervision, and keep a simple notebook recording what she noticed each day. 3 afternoons a week for 3 months. Caleb would pay her weekly. Martha immediately understood what he was trying not to call it. If this is charity, it isn't. Caleb's expression hardened. If Lucy doesn't do the work, she doesn't get paid. Lucy had been listening behind the doorway. "What's the horse's name?" Caleb looked past Martha. "Ranger." That was how. 2 days later, Lucy Bennett began working at Sullivan Horse Ranch. The Sullivan property seemed enormous compared with the Bennett farm. Long timber barns stood against rolling white pasture, and dozens of horses moved beyond the fences. Yet Ranger lived in a quieter paddock behind the main stable. He was 27 years old, a tall dark bay gelding whose coat had faded brown around the muzzle and eyes. His back dipped slightly with age, several scars crossed his left flank, and one ear carried a small triangular notch. Ranger moved slowly, but his dark eyes remained alert. He disliked sudden hands and flattened his ears whenever unfamiliar men approached too quickly. Caleb warned Lucy that years earlier the horse had been badly treated before learning to trust people again. Lucy entered the paddock carrying a brush. Ranger watched her. She stopped several feet away. "I'm not going to chase you," she whispered. 10 minutes passed before Ranger approached on his own. Caleb observed from the stable doorway. Something uncomfortable stirred inside him when Ranger lowered his head and allowed Lucy to touch his forehead. The old horse had once trusted another Bennett exactly that way. Caleb said nothing. Over the following weeks, Lucy established a routine. She recorded how much Ranger ate, whether his legs appeared stiff, and even which days he seemed irritated by the wind. Martha initially suspected Caleb had invented meaningless work, but when she examined Lucy's notebook, she found careful observations filling every page. More importantly, Lucy changed. She still wore Thomas's oversized coat, but she no longer tried to hide inside it. By the 3rd week, Ranger had begun waiting beside the gate when Lucy arrived. Then, one cold afternoon, everything changed. Lucy was brushing his neck when Ranger suddenly stopped chewing. His nostrils widened. He turned toward her shoulder and pressed his muzzle against the brass button near her collar. Lucy laughed softly. "That's not food, old man." Ranger jerked his head upward. His entire body became rigid. He sniffed the button again, harder this time, then released a low, trembling whinny. Caleb heard it from across the yard. His face drained of color. "Ranger." The gelding turned and walked rapidly toward the far fence. Lucy followed, confused. Ranger pushed through an unlatched service gate and continued across the snow toward the northern edge of the Sullivan property. "Lucy!" Caleb shouted. She followed until Ranger stopped before a structure she had never noticed. Half hidden by pine trees stood an old stone barn. Its roof sagged beneath the snow, its narrow windows were boarded over, and a heavy chain crossed the weathered double doors. Ranger pressed his nose against the wood. Then he struck the door once with his hoof. Caleb arrived moments later and immediately stepped between Lucy and the entrance. "You don't go inside." Lucy looked at the rusted chain. "Why?" Caleb stared at Ranger. "Because that barn has been locked for almost 18 years. That night, long after his ranch hands had gone home, Caleb entered his study and opened a small iron safe hidden behind a cabinet. From beneath property deeds and old contracts, he removed a faded photograph. 3 figures stood outside the same stone barn. The first was Caleb at 24. The second was Thomas Bennett. Between them stood a young dark bay horse with a triangular notch in his ear. "Ranger." Caleb slowly turned the photograph over. In Thomas's handwriting were 5 words. 3 stars. No horse forgotten. Caleb sat motionless. After nearly 18 years, Ranger had remembered. The next morning, Caleb came to the Bennett farmhouse before sunrise. He carried the old photograph inside his coat and a key so dark with age that Martha first mistook it for a piece of rusted iron. He placed both on the kitchen table without ceremony. Martha studied the younger Thomas in the photograph, then looked at Caleb. Her husband was smiling in a way she remembered well, one arm resting across Ranger's back. "You knew him," she said. It was not a question. Caleb nodded. "Long before you did." Nearly 20 years earlier, Caleb and Thomas had operated the stone barn together. Back then, Caleb had possessed little more than 20 acres, 3 horses, and a talent for getting himself into trouble. Thomas had been the calmer one. They rescued horses discarded by mining crews, freight companies, and ranches, animals with injured legs, harness scars, damaged eyes, or temperaments ruined by beatings. Thomas had created their mark, a horse beneath 3 stars. He said the stars meant patience, mercy, and another chance, Caleb explained. Ranger had been one of their rescues, found with rope burns around his legs and the triangular tear already missing from his ear. Martha struggled to reconcile that man with the husband she had known. Thomas had told her stories about cattle drives, broken wagons, even a saloon fight he insisted someone else started. He had never mentioned Caleb or the horses. What happened? Caleb's eyes shifted toward the window. Fire. 18 years earlier, a lantern had overturned during a winter night. The barn burned through its wooden interior before they could control the flames. They saved the horses, but the rescue operation never recovered. Caleb blamed himself for leaving the lantern unsecured. The guilt hardened him, driving him toward building the disciplined ranching empire he controlled today. Thomas went another direction. He wanted a quiet farm, a wife, children, and distance from what had happened. "Why didn't he tell me?" "I can't answer for a dead man," Caleb said. "But I think he wanted his new life to be more than his old wounds." By afternoon, Martha, Lucy, and Caleb stood before the stone barn. Ranger waited outside. Caleb inserted the old key. The lock resisted before surrendering with a metallic crack. Dust floated through narrow beams of daylight as the doors opened. Lucy had imagined treasure. Instead, she found rotting saddle racks, cracked harnesses, rusted horseshoes, veterinary notebooks, and faded wooden plaques bearing horses' names. Martha ran her fingers across one desk. Then Lucy noticed a cedar chest beneath it. Inside were bundles of letters tied with string. Caleb went still. He had never seen them. Lucy carefully lifted one envelope. "Mama." Across the front, in faded ink, Thomas had written, "For Martha, if the Bennett farm is ever threatened." Martha sat down before opening it. Thomas's words were simple. He apologized for leaving part of his life unexplained. He told her that if circumstances ever placed the farm in danger, she should find Caleb, not because Caleb was wealthy, but because Caleb understood what crossed their land. Martha frowned. What crossed our land? Beneath the letters lay a folded map. Caleb spread it across the desk. It showed the valley decades earlier, before most modern fences divided the surrounding ranches. A dark pencil line descended from the northern high country, passed directly through what was now Bennett Ranch, and continued into a sheltered southern basin. Caleb's expression sharpened. It's an old winter horse trail. Thomas had marked springs, slopes, and safe passages along the route. At the bottom he had circled a section of the Bennett property and written, "Low water never freezes." Caleb explained that during severe storms, livestock trapped on the exposed northern range could be moved through Bennett land into the protected basin. Most alternative routes were too steep or crossed streams that froze solid. Martha felt a chill unrelated to the weather. During the previous 6 months, Hale Cattle Company had purchased 3 neighboring properties. Now Caleb understood why. Someone was assembling control of the old corridor. But one piece remained outside their hands. The Bennett farm. Martha stared at Thomas's map, remembering strangers measuring distant fence lines, unusually generous offers to buy acreage, and gates she could have sworn she had closed. For months, she had believed people wanted her farm because she was a vulnerable widow. The truth was worse. They wanted it because Thomas had known exactly what the land could do. Caleb looked toward the open barn doors, where Ranger stood quietly beneath the falling snow. Thomas wasn't protecting a piece of dirt, he said. Martha slowly folded her husband's letter. He was protecting the only way through. 3 days after Martha discovered Thomas's map, Victor Hale rode onto Bennett land as though he already owned it. At 49, Hale was a large, thick-bodied man with iron-gray hair combed neatly away from a broad forehead, pale blue eyes, and a square face framed by carefully trimmed gray sideburns. His expensive black wool coat seemed almost absurd beside Martha's weathered barn. Victor had built Hale Cattle Company by buying struggling ranches during bad years, and success had taught him a dangerous lesson. Everyone had a price if enough pressure was applied. He offered Martha more money for Bennett Ranch than she had ever seen. She refused. Victor's pleasant expression barely changed. Winter has a way of changing people's minds. Over the following 2 weeks, Martha began understanding what he meant. A section of her eastern fence was cut during the night. 4 days later, part of her haystack burned before she managed to extinguish it. Then 2 regular customers in town suddenly stopped buying her eggs and milk. Neither would explain why. Martha had no proof Victor was responsible. That made it worse. Every lost dollar mattered. She began calculating how many weeks of hay remained, how long the roof could survive without repair, and whether refusing Hale was courage or simply another form of pride. One evening Lucy found her staring at Victor's written offer. "Are we selling?" Martha looked toward Thomas's old coat hanging beside the stove. "I don't know." It was the first time Lucy had ever heard her mother say those words. The answer never came. 2 nights later, Montana disappeared beneath a blizzard. The storm arrived with such violence that snow covered the lower fences within hours. At Sullivan Ranch, Caleb ordered every horse into shelter. Ranger became increasingly restless. The old gelding paced his stall, ignoring his feed and staring north into the darkness. Shortly after midnight, Lucy, who had remained at Sullivan Ranch with Martha because the road home had become impassable, heard repeated pounding from the stable. Ranger was striking his stall door. "Caleb!" By the time Caleb reached the barn, Ranger had forced the damaged latch open. The gelding pushed through the outer gate and vanished into the white darkness. Caleb swore and saddled immediately. Martha caught his arm. "He's 27. He'll die out there. Then we'd better find him." Caleb took 2 experienced ranch hands and followed Ranger's tracks. Martha and Lucy rode in the covered supply wagon behind them when Caleb realized Ranger was heading toward Bennett Ranch. Nearly an hour later, through the screaming wind, Lucy heard something. Not one horse. Dozens. When the wagon reached the northern Bennett fence, Martha stared in disbelief. Horses filled the darkness. 47 animals from Hale's high country herd were crowded along the fence line, their coats buried beneath snow, nostrils steaming, bodies pressed together in panic. Some were exhausted enough to stumble, and standing ahead of them was Ranger. The old gelding had not escaped. He had found them. More astonishingly, he had approached from the exact direction marked on Thomas's map. "The winter trail," Caleb breathed. The Hale horses had been driven from the exposed high country by the storm. Ranger had somehow returned to the corridor he had traveled decades earlier and brought them toward the sheltered southern basin. But Bennett's gate was chained. Martha climbed from the wagon. For one moment she remembered Victor's threats, the burned hay, the ruined fence, and the customers who had abandoned her. She could leave the gate closed. Instead, Martha removed the chain. "Open it." Caleb looked at her. "They're his horses." "No," Martha said. "Tonight they're just frightened animals." The gate swung wide. For hours they worked beneath lantern light, guiding the horses down through Bennett land. Lucy stayed beside Ranger while Caleb and his men handled the weakest animals. Martha opened the lower barn, emptied what remained of her own hay, and gave it to horses belonging to the man she believed was trying to destroy her. By dawn, the storm weakened. 45 horses stood alive in the protected basin. 2 had suffered severe exposure, but were still breathing under blankets inside Martha's barn. Then riders appeared along the northern ridge. Victor Hale came first. He stopped when he saw his herd. His expression moved from relief to disbelief as he recognized the land beneath their feet. "Bennett land." Caleb walked toward him. "Your upper fences failed." Victor looked past Caleb at Martha, who stood exhausted beside the open gate. Then he saw Ranger. The old horse stood beneath the pale morning sky, snow clinging to his mane, exactly where Thomas's map said the winter trail ended. Victor had spent weeks trying to force Martha Bennett from her property. Now the widow he wanted gone had opened that property to save 47 of his horses. And for the first time, Victor Hale understood why Bennett Ranch was worth far more than the price he had offered. By the time the roads reopened, everyone in town had heard what happened at Bennett Ranch. 47 Hale horses had survived the blizzard because Martha opened her gate, shared the hay she could barely afford, and allowed the herd to follow the forgotten winter corridor through her land. The story traveled faster than any accusation Victor Hale could silence. Men who had avoided Martha during her troubles arrived carrying fence posts and lumber. Women brought flour, preserves, and blankets. Even several customers who had stopped buying her eggs returned with embarrassed expressions and money in their pockets. Martha accepted their business, but not their apologies too easily. Hardship had taught her the difference between kindness and guilt. The truth about Victor came 3 days later. Elias Boone, a 31-year-old Hale ranch hand, arrived at the Bennett farmhouse shortly after dawn. Elias was a lean, weather-beaten man with reddish-brown hair, a crooked nose broken years earlier by a frightened colt, and nervous green eyes that rarely remained fixed on another person's face. He had worked for Hale for 6 years and was known as a dependable horseman, but raising 2 young sisters after their parents died had made him terrified of losing steady wages. That fear had kept him silent. Until the storm. Elias admitted Victor had ordered workers to cut sections of Martha's fence and pressure local buyers to stop dealing with her. Elias had not started the hay fire, and he could not prove Victor had ordered it, but he had personally damaged 1 fence and carried messages to 2 merchants. "I kept telling myself I needed the job," he said. "Then I watched you use your last hay saving his horses." His testimony, supported by the 2 merchants, was enough to force Victor into a settlement. He paid for the damaged fencing, lost income, and additional losses connected to the intimidation campaign. The fire remained unproven and was deliberately excluded. Victor came to Bennett Ranch once more. There was no threat this time. He looked older somehow. "You could have let my horses die," he said. Martha shook her head. "They didn't burn my fence." Victor had no answer. He left without asking about the land again. Weeks later, Caleb brought Martha another proposal. He did not offer to buy Bennett Ranch. Instead, he spread Thomas's old map across her kitchen table. "Your land has shelter. My ranch has money, horses, and men." Thomas had an idea neither of us finished. Caleb proposed turning part of Bennett Ranch into a permanent winter refuge and recovery station for injured horses. Sullivan Ranch would provide initial equipment and operating funds. Bennett Ranch would provide the land and Martha's management. Martha studied him carefully. "And who owns it?" "You and me. Equal partners." "Not charity?" Caleb smiled. "Absolutely not. You're far too difficult to give charity to." Martha laughed before she could stop herself. By spring, a new wooden sign stood beside the road. "Bennett Horse Refuge." Beneath it, carved smaller, was a horse under 3 stars. Several months later, Lucy returned to the same general store where Abigail Whitmore and Clara Finch had once laughed at her. The winter merchandise had been replaced by lighter coats and spring dresses. Lucy had enough money now, money she had earned caring for Ranger, to buy something new. The storekeeper showed her a beautiful fitted coat. "What about that old thing?" he asked, nodding toward Thomas's oversized leather coat. "Ready to retire it." Lucy looked down. The sleeves were still rolled. The shoulder patch remained darker than the original leather. The brass button was scratched from years of use. "No, sir." She buttoned it carefully. Across the store, Abigail saw her. Their eyes met. No one laughed. By then, everyone knew what the 3 stars meant. Years passed. Martha remained at Bennett Ranch, while Caleb expanded the refuge without ever changing its name. Ranger lived long enough to spend his final years grazing beside the restored stone barn where his story had begun. Lucy eventually grew into a tall, capable young woman and took over the refuge her parents' lives had unknowingly prepared for her. She rescued horses others considered too old, too scarred, or too difficult to save. And inside the refuge's first room, protected behind glass, hung an oversized brown leather coat. Visitors often asked why something so worn deserved such a place of honor. Beneath it was a small wooden plaque. Lucy had written the words herself. "The things people laugh at may be carrying a story they do not understand." Maybe the greatest miracle in Lucy Bennett's story was never the night 47 horses survived a Montana blizzard. Maybe the miracle had begun years earlier, when Thomas Bennett chose to show mercy to a frightened, wounded horse named Ranger. Thomas never lived long enough to see where that kindness would lead. He never saw Ranger recognize his old coat. He never watched that aging horse return to a forgotten trail, or lead desperate animals toward the land Thomas had once known could save them. But perhaps that is how some of God's miracles work. We plant a seed of kindness today without knowing who will rest beneath its shade years from now. Sometimes God does not answer our prayers by removing the storm. Sometimes he sends us something that remembers the road through it. A faithful friend, an unexpected opportunity, a forgotten lesson, or even an old horse carrying a memory everyone else had overlooked. Martha thought she was fighting simply to keep a struggling ranch. Lucy thought she was only holding on to her father's worn-out coat. Caleb thought a chapter of his life had been locked away forever. Yet somehow, those broken pieces found their way back together. And maybe there is something in your own life that feels worn, forgotten, or without value right now. Don't be too quick to throw it away. Don't be too quick to believe the people who laugh at it. God can use ordinary things in extraordinary ways. And sometimes what looks like the end of a story is only the place where another chapter quietly begins. If Lucy and Ranger's story touched your heart, share it with someone who may need a little hope today. And in the comments, tell us, have you ever experienced something in your life that felt like a small miracle arriving at exactly the right time? If you enjoy stories about kindness, second chances, faithful animals, and the unexpected ways lives can change, please subscribe and join us for the next story. And wherever you are watching from tonight, may God bless your home, protect the people and animals you love, give you strength for the storms you cannot avoid, and guide you toward the road that leads you safely home. God bless you, and thank you for spending this time with us.